It's the Real News Network, and I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. Canada is ratcheting up its effort to help oust Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro. Just last week, Canada's Foreign Minister, Chrystia Freeland, returned from a trip to Cuba where she lobbied Cuban officials to withdraw or at least reduce their support for the Maduro government. Before that, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had meetings or phone conversations with Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, European Council President Donald Tusk, and Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, all on the same topic on Venezuela. Here's what Chrystia Freeland had to say on Venezuela shortly before she left to Cuba last week.
The Maduro regime's chronic economic mismanagement has squandered Venezuela's enormous potential for prosperity. But we remain hopeful that under a freely elected government representing the best interests of Venezuela's people, prosperity can be restored. Canada is very proud to work with our hemispheric partners to find an urgent and sustainable solution to the crisis, and we will continue to seek new ways together to support the people of Venezuela.
Why is the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau so interested in ousting Maduro? Is it because Trudeau and Freeland are genuinely concerned about the situation in Venezuela? Joining me now to discuss this issue is Yves Engler. Yves is a Canadian commentator and author of several books. His most recent one is Left, Right, Marching to the Beat of Imperial Canada. Thanks again for joining us, Yves.
Thanks for having me.
So I have already mentioned a couple of the lobbying efforts that Freeland and Trudeau have been engaged with regard to Venezuela. And as far as we know, what are they hoping to achieve from these discussions about Venezuela with Cuba, Spain, the EU, and Japan? And are there any indications that they might be succeeding?
Well, I think they are trying to rally support for Juan Guaido, for the head of the National Assembly, who is self-appointed president. Trudeau also had a phone conversation with Juan Guaido last week. I think they have had some success in the diplomatic arena in terms of convincing other countries to join this effort to try to undermine Maduro's government. I think for some countries, from the standpoint of the Trump administration, it's better if the phone call is coming from Justin Trudeau than if it's coming from Donald Trump. So I think that Canada, to some extent, puts a little bit of a nicer face on this campaign to undermine the Venezuelan government, to undermine the Maduro government. Obviously, with regards to Venezuela specifically, they aren't having success. They have attempted to overthrow this government in a quite an open and aggressive way for the past 4 months, and that has not transpired. But they have been able to deepen the economic problems in the country. Canada brought in another round of sanctions against the fourth rounds of sanctions over the past 2 years in mid-April, sanctioning I think another 43 Venezuelan officials. So they have been able to build this international coalition of dozens of countries that are trying to isolate the Maduro government. Canada's been right at the center of that, and Freeland has been incredibly active in that campaign. But obviously, the main objective has been a failure. And with regards to Cuba specifically, it's obviously also been a failure. Cuba is still very much aligned with the Maduro government, despite this pressure, which I should also mention included a phone call from Trudeau representing the Lima group of governments opposed to the Maduro governments in the hemisphere, where Trudeau contacted the Cuban president to present the Lima Group's position to try to break off Cuba from Venezuela. But so no, I don't think it's been successful in its big objective, but it has been, I think, successful in developing an international coalition.
Mm-hmm. Now, what else has Freeland been doing with regard to Venezuela? Tell us about her actions with regard to the April 30th coup attempt, when self-declared interim President Juan Guaido called on the military to rise up against Maduro and claimed that segments of the military had joined him. What was Canada's reaction?
Well, immediately, Freeland was tweeting in favor, support of basically any violence that transpired. By definition, it was responsibility of the Maduro government, even though it was an open military coup attempt. She put out a video of her sort of speaking to the Venezuelan people to try to rally them to support these efforts. She immediately called for a emergency phone call meeting of the Lima Group, which put out of countries that are hostile to the Venezuelan government throughout the hemisphere, which that meeting put out a statement again, critical of the Maduro government. Then they had an emergency meeting of the Lima Group in person, which Freeland traveled to Chile, I believe it held. So it's it's this very active campaign of diplomatic interventions. Canada, there's another element that gets little attention, but Canada continues to give out this human rights prize, which they did at the end of April. They've been doing this for 10 years now to Venezuelan groups. They gave this prize out again. Another group that's hostile to the Maduro government. There's a long line of these human rights prizes that the Canadian Embassy in Caracas has been given out, and it's about building up oppositional forces, and these groups then get a tour of Canada, and they get a certain amount of money to go on this tour, and I believe they also they do some form of tour within Venezuela, and it leads to a certain amount of media attention. So it's really this continued pressure campaign.
As you're pointing out, there's a very big dichotomy that on the one hand, the Canada is completely in the Trump administration's corner when it comes to Venezuela, but on Cuba, they're steering a kind of a contradictory direction. That is, historically, there is connection between Cuba and Canada, and now apparently they're being pushed also to harshen their tone towards Cuba in order to pressure it on Venezuela. But I'm wondering what's at the bottom of this. That is, why is it that Canada is so interested and willing to play along with regard to Venezuela when clearly it doesn't want to play the same game with regard to Venezuela, with regard to Cuba, precisely because of these long historic relations, all of the investments that Canada has in Cuba, and the companies that could be affected now by these harshened sanctions that allow citizens, allow people basically to sue Canadian companies in U.S. courts if they benefited from the expropriations after the Cuban Revolution. So why do you think there's so much alignment on Venezuela but not on with regard to Cuba?
Yeah, I think that there's part of the thing with regards to Venezuela is clearly just the Liberal government supporting Washington and its aggressive campaign. But part of it is also the fact that there is a major segment of Canadian corporations that have been hostile to the Bolivarian revolution going back to the late 90s, early 2000s. And that's been expressed in many forms. The main segment of corporate Canada, there's Canadian banks that have, there's many stories about Canadian banks that have not been happy with the Chavez government and the Maduro government. Petro-Canada had some of its operations nationalized in 2007. But the main segment is the mining sector. And there's a number of major Canadian mining companies that have had multi-billion dollar, $1.3 billion, I think one, and $1.2 billion court decisions that they won against the Venezuelan government for having their gold concessions. Crystalex and Resuro had their gold concessions challenged by the Chavez government back in the early mid-2000s. And I think more broadly, Canadian mining dominates the hemisphere, and the Canadian mining sector has tens and tens of billions of dollars invested in Ecuador and Peru, in Mexico, and any moves towards more nationalistic resource policies are a threat to Canadian mining companies in Venezuela. So I think that the Freeland government is following Washington on Venezuela, but is also a major segment of corporate Canada that's hostile to the transformations in Venezuela. But I think also when we look at the Cuba question, sometimes I think there's been an exaggeration of how much Canada has been sympathetic to the Cuban revolution. And in fact, if you actually even go back to the fact that Canada and Mexico, I think, were the only two countries in the hemisphere that didn't break off diplomatic relations with Cuba after the revolution. And we have the internal files from this period that show that the Diefenbaker government in Canada actually was pressured by the Americans not to break off diplomatic relations. They didn't want to break off diplomatic relations because they wanted Canada to continue to spy for the U.S. on Cuba. And that transpired. And we have internal government documents that show that. The Communications Security Establishment, which is essentially Canada's version of the NSA, had major spying operations from the Canadian embassy in Havana. And Canada was even spying on Cuba from other countries in the hemisphere. So Canada, and during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Americans said that some of the best intelligence they got actually came from Canadian diplomats. So the Canada has always had a little bit of two faces to its policy vis-a-vis Cuba. Yes, Canada has continued diplomatic relations. Yes, there has been Canadian business relations, though after the Cuban Revolution, Canadian banks were nationalized, but they were compensated, unlike many American companies. So I think that there's also a history of Canada aligning against Cuba in Nicaragua, claiming that the Sandinistas in the 1980s, that this was Cubans were responsible for what was going on in Nicaragua. So there's also this history of Canada aligning with Washington's push of blaming Cuba for all the problems in the hemisphere and the like. So I think that in some ways this is you see it in the most open and kind of flagrant way with regards to Canada, Venezuela, Cuba right now, but it does also fit within a bit of a broader historical pattern.
Well, I think that's very important to keep in mind, but we're going to have to leave it there for now. I was speaking to Yves Engler, author and activist from Canada. Thanks again, Yves, for having joined us today.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.